Good afternoon and welcome to all of you. Speakers, discussant, chairs, public of these 2 days of conference. I will open this afternoon by giving the floor, first of all, to Vincenzo Barone, Direttore della Scuola Normale Superiore, who will say some words about this initiative. Vincenzo?
Yeah. Welcome to all of you. I will be very short because I let the time to more interesting contributions. I want to simply tell you that this is the first workshop organized in the framework of the newborn Ciampi Institute, Ciampi Chair at Florence. I'm very happy that we essentially, Donatella and Mario, have been able to organize this conference on this very interesting subject, and before the end of this year, which was not at all obvious since we started with some delay for a reason that I skip in this audience, but which are typical of bureaucracy and administration, etc. These witnesses, in my view, and that's the only thing I'll say, the idea of the Scuola Normale to widen its interests, because the tradition is about hard sciences and humanities, and the social sciences and politics are very new in the Scuola Normale, and I hope that after more or less 5 years or something like that, these friends and the part of the Scuola in Florence consider to be really part of the great family of the Scuola Normale. I strongly insist on that because this is a very nice family, but which has his rules which are not obvious for beginners, and I know that it has been a quite difficult process, but I hope that now it is more or less concluded, and we can start to work together to further widen the scope and the ideas in the Scuola Normale with the contribution of all of you. The last thing is that in the next future, I hope we can start a new adventure, which is the real Ciampi Institute, which will be devoted more or less on communication and interdisciplinary matters, with the contribution of all the people of the different classes and departments of the Scuola Normale. I stop here. I give again my welcome to all of you. I hope you are you stay very well in Florence, and it is not. It is obvious that you are in a very nice place, but I hope that you are in a nice place also from the point of view of Scuola Normale, and I am sure that you will have a very nice workshop. Thank you for being here, and you are welcome. And I let Donatella to start the official part of the conference.
Thank you very much, Enzo. I just wanted to welcome all of you, telling a few words about the origins of the idea of this conference and what we hope to have in as a central point in our discussions in these 2 days. First of all, it is an occasion to welcome the Ciampi program and the Ciampi chair, which is represented by Mario Pianta, and who I will introduce later on as one of the paper givers, but I want to thank now already, as the director did, for all the enthusiasm and commitment that he put in the organization of this conference. And as you know, this is just part of a set of two conferences on issues of inequalities and democracies. This is also an important moment for our Department of Political and Social Sciences, because with the entrance of Mario, we also enlarge our interest by introducing also a connections between political science, sociology, and economic issues, especially political economy. And in fact, the idea for this conference came already from the many occasions in which we started to discuss the issues of the interactions between economic inequalities, type of development in the interactions between the market and the state, and the many challenges to democracies. In fact, the idea of the first conference of these two ones, inequalities, representation and participations, developed on the basis of first empirical observations, which is that for sure increasing inequalities are a challenge for democracy. We knew it, but we learned it in steps, because in the beginning it was extreme forms of inequality that produced the challenges in terms of, for instance, anti-IMF riots in the past, so extreme inequalities. But then the second wave that pointed at the challenges that inequalities poses for democracy was already more inside Europe, and it was related with economies that didn't present extreme forms of inequalities, but on which austerity policies as reactions to the economic crisis produced challenges to establish democracies in different forms, in the forms of massive wave of protest, but also in the forms of electoral earthquakes in several of the countries that had been more hit by inequalities. What we have learned now in this third step is that the problem is not only of the European peripheries that were mostly hit or most hardly hit by the economic crisis, but the challenge to democracy we have also in Scandinavian countries, in Austria or the Netherlands, or in Germany, so the countries which were supposed to be, if not on the winning sides of neoliberal globalizations, at least to have suffered less. But what we see also there is that democracies, as we had learned to know them, have been challenged, that the parties at the center of the political spectrum that had led the democratic development until a few years ago are now on the losing side. The political center is emptied out, and the more radical type of positions on the left and on the right are polarizing the political spectrum. So it is inequalities not only in the extreme forms and not only in the countries in which the economic crisis was stronger. This is an empirical issue that, of course, has been addressed in different type of analysis. But what I think we are missing and we want to develop here is a more, collective frames, interdisciplinary frames, or transdisciplinary frames. Wolfgang Streeck observed some time ago that in order to understand big societal challenges, we also need to go back to some concepts that we have not used for a long time in the social sciences, like capitalism and classes, for instance, and also to try to overcome the specializations of the different disciplines and learn to discuss more across disciplines. And I think we need to do this also because all the explanations about why inequalities and democracies are a challenge for each other are to a certain extent proved insufficient nowadays. So I'm thinking about political science, which I know better, developmental theories that assume that democracy would follow economic growth and facilitate it, so that there would be a sort of virtuous circles between economic development and democracy, have been disproved to a certain extent by the increase and dramatic increase of inequalities within what was once considered as established democracies, a concept which we can less and less use nowadays. The assumption was that capitalism needed democracy, that it needed to expand the middle classes and it needed to expand education. But this doesn't seem to be the case any longer if we look at the way in which our societies are evolving. So we need to face this type of theoretical challenges with new type of instruments. Also, the other type of explanations for the development of democracies as capable of reducing social inequalities and produce prosperities have been challenged. The idea that more equalities was also related to the winning struggles of some agents, like the working class, that was at the basis of the expansions of the citizenship rights, has been challenged by the type of evolutions that we are looking at now. So I think that's building upon previous theories can give us some insight, but we need to develop all new type of explanations in order to understand nowadays challenges, and that this can come from the dialogue that we are trying to develop among others in this conference. In the conference, we want to acknowledge the challenges, but also look at the potential agencies and also potential alternatives that could lead to overcome these vicious cycles. The challenges to democracies have been produced also resistance on different sides. Some type of the resistances to inequalities is challenging the visions of pluralism, inclusiveness, tolerance, and equality, but other alternative visions of democracies could instead help the development of alternative politics and policies that could address both the increasing inequalities and decreasing qualities of democracies. So this is the issues we would like to address. One of the ideas of this, of today and tomorrow's encounters is that we have also to look at different territorial type of development of inequalities, and that we need to look at the intersections of different types of inequalities. So we want to go beyond Europe and the global north, looking also in at the global south, and we want to go beyond the analysis of class inequalities, looking also at the dimension of gender inequalities, of ethnic inequalities, and the intersections of these different forms of inequality. So we want to try to understand how inequalities is challenging democracies, and we want to see what we could, as scholars, develop in terms of alternatives. And we have many important scholars that can help us in doing this. So I want to go now in the finishing with the welcoming and inviting also the panelists of our opening sessions today to join us in the podium. Colin Crouch. Is the first one, and in fact is the one who has helped me also in past collaboration to focus their attention on this type of issues. Colin Crouch, University of Oxford, European University Institute, Warwick, and now Emeritus for Warwick, is one of our visitors under the Champi Chair, so long-time visitors, is the author of important research on labor market movements and relations between politics and democracies. In fact, his work on post-democracies has been one of the first to focus attentions on the political version of neoliberalism and how neoliberalism has been affecting the ways in which democracy developed. So his work on post-democracy, but also on the strange non-death of neoliberalism, and more recent work on making capitalism fit for society, knowledge corruptors, consequences of the financial takeover of public life, I think are all important to help us in these directions. So, Colin, you have the floor.
If you are an ambitious person and the good fairy comes to you and says, you can have a particular very expensive object, a yacht or a large house, or you can have some money of the same value, it's always rational to choose the money. Because with the money, you might have the yacht or the house, but you might choose to do something else. Because money can be converted into many other goods and services. If you're an ambitious politician and the good fairy comes to you and says, would you like to achieve a particular policy goal, or would you like to have more general power? It's always rational to say more power. Because with more power, you might go for that particular policy goal, or you might go for something else. You might want to keep it for another time. Money and power have these characteristics that make them differ from almost everything else, in that you can convert them into anything else. You can use money to buy almost anything. You can use power to get and command almost anything. That's why they play a massively important and often extremely destructive role in human life. They can also be converted into each other. If you have enough money, if you have large quantities of money, you can buy political power. If you have large quantities of political power, you can use it to get money in various ways. And so money and power, they can be converted not only into other things, but into each other. And that's what makes them so absolutely fundamental. It's also that especially when they come in large concentrations, when there's extreme inequality of money and power, they have this particularly virulent role in our lives. And when they come together in conditions of considerable inequality, they are fatal for two institutions that are very important in modern life, democracy and the market economy. Because democracy depends partly on an inability of inequalities of wealth to affect political outcomes. And the market economy depends partly on an avoidance of extreme inequalities of wealth, actually, which I'll discuss in a minute. And it certainly depends on an avoidance of involvement of politics, of political power in economic decisions. The concentrations of money and power are extremely likely to happen, and they have very negative consequences for democracy and the market economy. And therefore, there's a lot of interest to be taken in how do we avoid that concentration of money and power damaging these two vitally important institutions. Classical economic theory really says that the problem of inequality isn't so bad, because if you've got a really competitive economy where you get concentrations of wealth through successful entrepreneurial activity, others will see the wealth developing and they will therefore enter the arena, they will enter that sector, and eventually that will bring earnings down. So the classical economic theory has an approach to inequality that says, yeah, inequality is a good thing, it's a reward to enterprise, etc., but actually, if you've got a really competitive economy, inequality should be doing this all the time. It should be going up, but then it comes down. So in the long run, no particular group should be dominant. Now, this is an extremely unrealistic description of how the capitalist economy works in practice, because, as Elena Granali is going to discuss in more detail later on, there are many reasons why it's very difficult to enter markets, and you get accumulations of imperfect competition that lead to continuing inequalities. And then classical economic theory, or neoclassical theory, says, well, we can solve this because we can have mechanisms in competition law that prevent these accumulations of wealth. And so a lot of effort went into economic policy making for many years to try to reduce inadequate competition, to try to ensure that competition continues. This also is highly unrealistic, because there are several sectors like energy, where and nowadays the new platform economies that neoclassical economics didn't know anything about, where the rewards to scale are so enormous that it's almost impossible to ensure easy access for new entrants into the market. And then alongside that has come a new set of economic theories developing in the 1980s, really, 70s and 80s, that said actually a competitive market economy was not about continuing competition. A competitive economy means an economy in which the winners have won, full stop. Right? So if one firm becomes totally dominant in a market, that's it, competition over, and it should be allowed to continue. And so one's got now, especially in the United States, approach to competition, far more tolerance than in the past of enormous concentrations of wealth. So the capacity of economic theory and of economic policy to deal with the tendency within the economy towards extreme concentrations of wealth has weakened considerably. And this is one of the reasons why there is far more inequality now. That ability to ensure that competition meant reduced inequalities has simply not worked. Then alongside that, something else has happened, and that is that neoclassical economics and the whole concept of market capitalism is meant to mean that economic and political power can't be converted into each other. There's meant to be a separation between the two. It's a fundamental objection of capitalist theory to socialism, is that it's necessary for economic and political power to be kept separate. But a lot of the theories that underline that have been undermined in recent years because, to start with, in practice, it's extremely difficult to prevent concentrations of economic power not being used politically. What you can do is to define that as corruption. If you define it as corruption, then at least in theory you can do something about it. But there's been and we have had in many countries quite strong rules that tried to limit the influence that business people, wealthy business people, can have over politics. A lot of that has been undermined in recent years through the doctrines of new public management, which argued that the public sector is always less competent than the private sector because it doesn't face competition. Therefore, it's always good if the public sector is exposed to a lot of influence from the private sector. And a lot of the rules that, for example, prevented politicians and civil servants going into business as soon as they left office, or rules that limited the extent to which firms can come directly into government. A lot of these rules have been abolished in a large number of countries. And now it's considered good if corporations have seconded staff into the offices of ministers, or if ministers, as soon as they've left office, go off and work for companies whose work they were supervising when they were in office. So many of the barriers that prevented wealth and power getting at each other have been cast down. So we're living in a period now when not only are inequalities increasing, but the barriers that protected both the democratic system and the market economy from these from mutual interference are disappearing. Now, I've been looking so far just at the way in which attempts to protect the economy from the impact of inequalities have been weakened. But the same, but that also begins to argue about how it's become more difficult to protect the integrity of the political system from interference from wealth. For a long time, arguments about democracy in capitalist society depended on arguments about pluralism, particularly those theories developed in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, said that, okay, you would never get political equality, really, but so long as no one group won all the time, and so long as various different interests could win some of the time, then that's probably as near as you could get to democracy. What you needed to avoid was a situation where winning blocs tended to spread themselves right across a whole range of different issues. And that's what the theory of pluralism was. If societies were organized in certain ways, then there wouldn't be concentrations of political power. It's very similar to the argument about a large number of firms preventing the concentration of economic inequality. It's a market-type argument. And then alongside arguments about pluralism, there developed another argument that said, this is the theory of collective action, that said that actually we needn't worry about the political system being under enormous strain from lots of groups constantly fighting and struggling for influence, because actually it was very, very difficult to organize political power. There are all sorts of reasons that you all know about as to why not many groups really were able to organize mass support. But none of those arguments about the difficulty of organizing political influence apply to people with large concentrations of wealth, because they don't need to organize anything, they simply command. And if you're trying to organize a new social movement and you're dependent on getting people to join it, getting them to give you a little bit of money so that you can employ some people in an office who organize demonstrations for you and print leaflets, then you've got a very hard job, and the logic of collective action works against you. But if you can simply say, right, I'm going to buy some people to work in an office for me and buy people to buy leaflets out of my fund of personal wealth, then you don't have any problem with the logic of collective action. Because the best single example we've seen of that was when Silvio Berlusconi was able to form a political party overnight simply by setting it up within his firm. And so the logic of collective action, although it helped explain why politics wasn't subjected to a mass of conflicting interests and destabilizing politicking, it also, unfortunately, showed why concentrations of wealth could actually have enormous political power. People who were dependent on organizing from the bottom up, organizing mass movements, whether it's, say, small firms or workers, whatever it was, people trying to do that would always have a harder time trying to get political influence than people who could just buy it. And so once again, wealth and power were seen within the heart of capitalist democracy, were seen to be attacking the integrity of both democracy and the market economy. These things don't matter so much if there's not so much inequality. And it's interesting that the theories of pluralism were developed at what Thomas Piketty has now shown us to be a period when inequality was particularly low in the Western world, 50s and 60s, possibly the 70s. Since then, we've seen what now appears to be a return to normality, which is societies of very considerable inequalities of wealth, which means that these problems of wealth and power coming together to undermine the integrity of both the market economy and democracy are very, very real and problematic. We also see in our recent history the spiral of the relationship between inequalities of wealth and inequalities of power and the ability of one to work in the territory of the other. If we look at the changes in taxation systems over the last 30 years, how the taxation of capital and of corporations has gone down, and the taxation of incomes from labour have gone up. That increasingly corporations have a much easier time fiscally. We've seen sectors that have become are fundamental to how our lives function, acquire through that means a political power, which then helps them also assert their economic interests. We saw the way in which the financial sector had to be privileged in solving the crisis of 2008. We see the power of the energy sector in really opposing most effective means of dealing with climate change, which then in turn increases the income going to the energy sector, which makes it even more politically powerful. So in many ways, we are seeing in our contemporary society ways in which increasing inequality of wealth and income is actually undermining, as I say, both democracy and the market economy, and doing so in a self-reinforcing way that is therefore creating major problems for both these institutions.
Thank you, Colin. Colin touched upon an issue which I think is central for us when he said at the end, we discovered that what we thought was a trend in the 60s and the 70s towards decreasing inequalities and increasing democracies, in the reality was not part of a trend, but it was just a moment, which was characterized by some specific characteristics. And then he pointed also at something that Mario Pianta will also address, which is what happens when inequalities start to feed each other in the political and socioeconomic dimensions. Mario Pianta will talk about the four engines of these vicious cycles of increasing inequalities. Mario Pianta is a very heterodox economist, may I say so. He's originally University of Urbino, now at Roma Tre, but on the 1st of November he will join our department, I'm very glad to say, for at least 3 years. with a championship and develop this research on interactions also between economic and political inequalities. He is also a member of the Accademia Nazionale dei Licei and authors of several important books, very much focusing also on the issues of inequalities, but also active in the search for alternatives, empowering civil society organizations in search for these emancipatory alternatives. He is the authors, among others, of an important studies, is Uno su 10, and of explaining inequalities together with Francini, and I leave him the floor to talk about the 4 engines of inequalities. Thanks. Sì, aspetta, ci rifaccio 10.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to work with Scuola Normale Superiore. I thank the director of the Scuola Normale Superiore. I thank the head of the Department of Political and Social Sciences, Donatella Della Porta. Thanks to the members of the department with whom we have started to cooperate, and a special thanks to the staff and the technical staff which has been made this conference possible in addressing all the practical challenges for putting together such a large group of important guests. What is at the core of this conference, building on what Donatella has already said, is the challenge to open up a dialogue between different disciplines, in particular between economic analysis on the one hand, political and social sciences on the other, on our understanding of a major political and social challenge of today, which is the rise of inequality beyond the levels that we were used to understand and codify them, and basically the set of challenges that Colin Crouch just listed in terms of how this new economic and social structure challenges fundamental elements of our societies and of the political processes governing them, and namely, what is the future of democracy in this context. So what we try to do, what I do in my presentation is to focus on an effort to identify fundamental drivers of these economic inequalities and outline some implications and consequences for the political processes. The economics of inequality as basically moves from an understanding of how the cake of the product that economic activities produce is divided between, first of all, capital and labor, and therefore the dynamics of the functional distribution of income is the first step we have to understand. But within profits, there is an increasing change with a greater share and influence taken up by finance through financial rents, with a process which is totally different from the traditional allocation of earnings to capital. Within wages, we are facing another important challenge, because within workers, there has been a much greater individualization of activities, and the diversity and inequalities within wage earners has become a major novel challenge, changing quite a lot the dynamics of distribution. And then, of course, there are a lot of other dimensions. People earn individual income, then they live in families where different sources of incomes are put together. There are this household dimension. There is the role of families that will be discussed later tomorrow by Maurizio Franzini and Annalisa Murgia and others, and Chiara Saraceno, because the reproduction of inequalities in a society is not just an economic process, is something that is happening very clearly also in this dynamics. Conversely, politics matter for economic inequality quite deeply, because we have a political decision on a lot of earnings that are obtained by capital or by labor. We have political decision on minimum wages in some cases, or on the power of trade unions to set wages. We had for a long time a political decision to compress finance, to limit its ability to earn extreme financial rents. That was eliminated in the last couple of decades, opening up for the rise of financial rents. We have, of course, taxes and public expenditure, which account for 45% of GDP. An important part of the cake of the income is not distributed through economic processes, is distributed through political decisions, which reallocate shares of the cake on the basis of need, of social condition, of age, and so on. And all this social and political redistribution takes place through in a context of a complex social relation, which creates in turn new types of inequality: inequality of access to services, inequality of citizenship, and the question of migrants is, which is becoming an important social issue to be addressed, is clearly also an issue of who are those entitled to have access to these benefits from welfare in terms of citizenship and so on. So, on top of these are the sort of simple questions. The bigger questions are the ones that Colin just outlined. How this set of political decisions reshapes the boundaries of democracy, the process of democracy, and what are the social responses when economic inequality gets bigger and political processes get more challenged. Just two pictures to show the fall of wages. This is the share of national income obtained by labor. Over 20 years, 30 years, we had a 10 to 15% fall in the share of income going to wages. As I said, wages include very high wages by top managers, so this is not a real picture of inequality, but gives us a sense of the impoverishment of labor, and that's the empowerment of capital, which have in turn gained, again with the major role played by financial rents, has gained a bigger share of the cake. Interestingly enough, the crisis in Southern Europe has produced a collapse of the labor share in Spain and Greece in particular. Normally, during crisis, there is an immediate fall of the capital share because profits and financial assets fall immediately after the crisis. What we have seen is an ability of capital to recover immediately these benefits, while on the other hand, workers have been losing jobs, and so there has been a permanent loss in wages. In a lot of studies we have done at the industry level, at the national level, at the firm level, we have found that profits are sustained by a variety of sources. The monopolistic power that Colin mentioned before, but also the Schumpeterian type of profits, which go to the firms and the industries where there is a technological advantage, a technological competitiveness, and the ability to provide clearly higher quality economic activities, but also there is opportunistic behavior, which of course allows greater profits when there is lower taxation or tax evasion and so on. On the other hand, wages tend to be higher when there is high education and high skill of workers, are higher when there is a unionization and the ability of workers to bargain better condition, are higher when there are public policy rules which protect employment with a variety of welfare systems, pension systems, and protection from sacking, and a lot of, conversely, precarization of work has a clear impact on lower wages. One of the main reasons why wages have been losing ground in absolute terms and in relative terms is the fact that in the last 30 years they have not been catching up with productivity gains. Productivity output divided by labor input is a clear measure of the ability of the cake to grow. And of course, if the share of labor doesn't grow as the cake grows, its importance is reduced. And what we have seen here, this is ILO data, but there are a lot of evidence, basically wages have been stagnant, unable to catch up to obtain part of the productivity gains, which, as a matter of fact, are the result of the use of labor, the use of more skilled labor, of greater competencies and capabilities. So the story of inequality for advanced countries, we will hear tomorrow from Andrea Cornia and others the story of Latin America. The story of Europe is the concentration of a larger share of incomes in the hands of the 10%, within the 10%, the 1%, within the 1%, the 0.1% of the richest group of the population, with an overall stagnation of median income and a collapse of the incomes of the poor, a collapse of the bottom 25%, but overall a collapse, a reduction of the lower half of the distribution. We had economists don't have a great imagination, and so a lot of the efforts to explain this type of dramatic shift in economic trends has been sort of playing with little short-term factors, education, skills, opening up of economies to global trends, and so on. So it's interesting that most of the questions have been asked by international organizations such as the OECD, who produced several reports, or the IMF, and they identified some of the good answers: finance, trade, technology, and so on. The problem is that we are really missing a comprehensive, organic, satisfactory explanation of what are the causes of this inequality. We had a big, important book by Thomas Piketty, which basically gave an important contribution, but focused on a rather mechanistic approach, saying that the expansion of the value of capital, the increase of the capital income ratio, which basically doubled over these 30 years, was the statistical determinant of raising inequality. But in his explanation, there are a number of weaknesses. He identifies capital with wealth, so the artwork in Florence are all considered capital, not productive capital, capital which is able to accumulate and produce more value itself. Secondly, there is no distinction between financial capital and productive capital. Third, there is this idea that there are never breaks. The history of capitalism is the history of cycles of accumulation. So there are periods when there is an expansion of financial values, but there are periods when, as in the crisis, there is a collapse of these values. So with the projection of, in the future of past trends, Piketty says that inequality will continue because there will, an increasing part of output will be appropriated by capital to reward its accumulation. And there will be an increasingly small slice left to workers. Clearly, we have clear evidence of this concentration of income in the hands of the richest 10% in the US and Europe. This is from Piketty's book. We have data for the 1% getting a higher share. The contribution we produced with Maurizio Franzini in the book Explaining Inequality tries to summarize from this variety of interpretation, a more organic capability to explain the engines of inequality. And we argue that there are 4 engines which have a different nature. The overall economic engine is the increased power of capital over labor, but there is an oligarchic process within capitalism, which has to do with the argument about power made by Colin Crouch a moment ago. And there is, within labor, an individualization of economic condition, which is breaking the ability of labor to operate as in the past. And then there is a specifically political dynamics, which is the retreat of politics from its function in redistributing and governing these dynamics. This is the summary table that we propose to understand how the set of engines interact with different mechanisms and ends up with pushing profits on the one end or pushing down wages on the other, or moving more wealth in the hands of the elite, and or reusing redistribution. Let me just briefly overview these 4 engines. Within the power of capital over labor, we have 4 components. The first one is the power of finance, which is, as already been mentioned, has been controlling an increasing share of profits. We know that finance is creating speculative bubbles in stock markets. After 2008, finance has been able to multiply by a factor of 4 the value of stock markets in major stock exchanges. And of course, this is totally unrelated to the real value of these activities. In terms of control over labor, we have the OECD itself pointing out the weakening of the labor and the unions in maintaining the wage share. And in the case of Italy, we have used the data developed by Franzini, Raitano, and Bloise on Italian employees. What we see is that in the long run, over 30 years, the mean wage of Italian employees has basically been stable with a decline since 1991, and only the top 10% has increased the level of wages. So only the very highly paid managers and professionals have been gaining something over a generation. We are talking about a change over a generation, not just a short-term change, while the bottom 10% had a loss of 30% of its income. So this idea of losing ground one generation after the other is becoming very, very serious. And the other side of the coin is that the share of temporary workers doubled, and now 1/4 of Italian workers is on temporary contracts. Technological change and international production and globalization are other important dynamics, and all of these has created a shift. For instance, wages are paid much less in low-tech industries and are expanding in high-tech industries. And of course, wages are also shaped by individual characteristics, education, and so on. The set of these elements, finance, control over labor, technology, and globalization, has been tilting the balance in favor of capital against workers in income distribution. Oligarchic capitalism has been already mentioned. Maurizio Franzini will probably discuss tomorrow the reproduction of inequality. One element of this type of inequalities is that they are reproduced one generation from the next. And this is the data about high income, high inequality countries are the countries where the next generation follows exactly the previous generation type of disparities. So this means that society become immobile. We are moving towards an ancien regime. So the promise of capitalism to get people free, set people free from feudalism, are not being implemented. I don't talk much about individualization of economic condition that will be discussed tomorrow by other contribution, but clearly there is one of the heritage of neoliberalism has been the emphasis on individual merit, individual identities, the individual based compensation of workers, and this cultural change has pushed to a much greater acceptance, social acceptance of diversity and inequalities, which a generation ago would have not been acceptable. Finally, the retreat of politics has meant that less public policies, that overall distribution processes are less affected by public policies. There has been a retrenchment of the public management of economic activities, privatization, public partnerships. The extension of market activities means that the same activity, for instance, the provision of services, which before was offered as the implementation of a social right, becomes a commodity bought in the market. And if we turn the health service from a right to a commodity, clearly the amount of economic activities which produce inequalities expands. So more activities are inequality producing, while if we have a public provision of activities, we are reducing inequality by definition. And finally, clear area of policy is taxation, social expenditure, and redistribution, which have been retrenched in all countries. Just a few points on the political consequences of this complex. If we understand inequality as the result of these four engines, we see that the concentration of economic power that Colin already discussed is capable to set the political agenda, provide funding for political campaign, lobby on decision, and reproduce economic privilege and the oligarchic nature of power organization. So the challenge is exactly what was discussed before, inequality versus democracy, while at the same time, and we will have Donatella discussing this tomorrow, there has been an inability to frame the issue of inequality in terms of progressive egalitarian politics. Why? Because in a way, inequality is the end outcome of a number of social mobilization at work on social rights and so on, and it's not easy to conceptualize as a direct political factor mobilizing people. There has been greater social acceptance of disparities, and the political process has ignored, especially in Europe. Bernie Sanders in the US, in a way, is the only political campaigner which has put inequality clearly at the center of these dynamics. But at the same time, as we will hear tomorrow, inequality creates a political and social dynamics, both in society, in terms of mobilization and activism, as Donatella will tell us tomorrow, but also in terms of political behavior and voting. And so we have an overlapping of traditional progressive protest, populist, new types of populist mobilization, and extreme right mobilization. So these calls, and that's the starting point of our conference, for an effort to carry out a broader research agenda combining political, social, and economic issues. And just to give us some very superficial preliminary direction of what can be the direction to explore, the parallels between social deprivation, unemployment, and right-wing vote in Germany are striking, especially in Eastern Germany. But using our Italian data that I just showed about wages a moment ago, there is a striking parallel between the geographical distribution of the vote to the five-star movement and the concentration of the 10% of the poorest workers in the Italian employment. And the same story applies to workers having temporary contracts. So precarization of work and low wages are a clear driver of impoverishment, insecurity, instability, and this in turn mobilizes political changes in behavior. We can look at the unemployment. We have the same picture here with the number of young people not in employment, education, or training. and also the Gini coefficient of Italian region correlates quite strongly with the importance of a vote to the five-star movement. Just clearly, these are very superficial associations which can tell us a direction for investigating how this interaction between political processes, electoral consequences, and the underlying social structures and economic inequalities interact. I think this is both intellectually stimulating, very interesting from the aspect of academic research, but very important for the political challenges of our societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Now I call to the podium Elena Granaglia, who is Professor of Scienze delle Finanze, Financial Sciences at the University of Roma III. And she's been working successfully on theories of distributive justice, extreme poverty, policies against extreme poverty, inequalities. And as it was mentioned by both Colin and Mario, inequalities has been considered sometimes as an engine of progress, of transformations. So there have been some attempt to justify inequalities. And this is a topic that Elena is addressing. She's been working also with Maurizio Franzini and Michele Reitano on, for instance, a book, Dobbiamo preoccuparci dei ricchi? Should we care or be preoccupied about the rich and extreme inequalities in contemporary capitalism? And her presentations will be on a critique of attempt to justify qualities and shaky foundations of meritocratic stance. Elena, thank you very much for your...
Okay. Again, thank you very much for the invitation. Mario Pianta gave us a beautiful fresco of very many dimensions and the causes of inequality and so on. My presentation will go a little in detail about just one driver of inequality, one engine of inequality, and the engine of inequality I will deal with has to do with the social norms. I think that changes in social norms have influenced the dynamics of inequality. Krugman already in 2002 talked about the changes of social norms as one of the drivers of inequality. Piketty took this point again, but I think social norms are quite underrated as an explanation, as a driver of inequality. Obviously not the driver, but certainly they contributed to the growth of inequality. There are very many social norms which can favor inequality, so we can justify inequality, like, for example, growth is good for inequality, trickle-down effect, for example, or basic inevitability. Inequality is inevitable, as we often hear today. Yet, as Littler, she just published a very nice book against meritocracy, and meritocracy has certainly played an important role in justifying the growth of inequality. And as she says, meritocracy has been the key cultural means of legitimation for contemporary neoliberal culture, the idea that what we get on the market is deserved. We deserve inequalities that we get on the market. Politics, no, but the market, yes. My thesis is that meritocratic justification of market inequalities is full of problems, full of shortcomings, and these shortcomings are both contingent and intrinsic. And I think it's important to unmask these shortcomings to challenge current economic inequality. The focus of this presentation will be on intrinsic shortcomings. Why? Because I think contingent shortcomings, which have to do basically with the fact that current markets are far from satisfying meritocracy because there is a lot of concentration, as Colin Crouch was talking about, the powers of the giants in current market, and we also know that in current market there is a violation of equality of opportunity in many dimensions, and obviously competition and equality of opportunity are main element of meritocracy. So one may say, well, current markets are not always meritocratic, but the market, if they were nicely regulated, they could be meritocratic. So my point is that I prefer to focus on intrinsic shortcomings because I think that the other shortcomings are becoming more and more acknowledged in public discussion. For example, the redistribution, the Acker and his strategy, for example, they point to the importance of a competitive strategy to have an antitrust and so on to try to counter the power of the giants. And so, at least verbally, everybody is for equality of opportunity and leveling the playing field. While I think the awareness on the intrinsic limits of the meritocratic justification of market inequalities is quite underrated, and I will try to deal with this aspect and only with this aspect. Just a few specifications. What do I mean by meritocratic justification of market inequalities? Basically, following it's quite easy, but it's quite understandable anyway. Meritocracy is, as Mason wrote in a very nice article on meritocracy, meritocracy can be summarized in three main elements. Merit is ability plus effort, and performance related to ability and effort. Competition is crucial to meritocracy because you have meritocracy as competition as the main mechanism to assess merit, and merit is the criterion to win the competitive the competition, the competitive game, and to get all the rewards associated to it. I underline "and" because there are lots of philosophers, as you probably know, like for example, John Rawls is the first one. John Rawls was accepting the criteria of merit to win the competitive game, but not to justify differences in rewards. So meritocracy, on the contrary, has merit as the criterion for accessing a position and to justify differences in a reward. Now the main argument. I have basically three sets of intrinsic limits of the meritocratic justification of market inequality. Set number one, inevitability of entry barriers. We were just talking about this problem before, and the point is, this is probably the less strong criticism, but I want to make it in anyway. And even if we pursue the strongest pro-competitive strategy, barriers due to imperfect information, brand, non-rivalry of knowledge and networks, intellectual property rights, network demand effects, and so on, are in a way inevitable. Even if we pursue the best antitrust, if we don't do the antitrust that we're talking about of the 60s, that would justify concentration for consumer welfare, but even if we do the best one for consumer choice, it's very hard to fight all, to reduce all these barriers. And then again, we have another problem Colin Crouch was talking about, that if markets take the configuration of winner-take-all market, and we know they do, especially when IT technology is so important, winner-take-all market mean that even in the case you win through a competitive process, so even in that case, once you win, you become a monopolist, and that, and then you can behave as a monopolist. And so I think that some entry barriers are inevitable, and as long as they are inevitable, if we want to justify using a meritocratic argument, those inequalities we just can't. If we do an ideological justification which is not reasonable, which is unreasonable. As I said, this is an important point, I think, but it's not so strong, because one could say, okay, there is no perfection. For example, as Amartya Sen would tell us, there is no perfect idea of justice. We cannot kind of just approach, but we'll never get there. And so maybe you could say, okay, markets are not perfect, they are not completely without barriers, but at least we try to get there. So I will go to other set of problems which I think are more important. And these are, sorry, I know I have 20 minutes, so I was going fast. And the second set of problem has to do with the marketing capacity to reward merit. Okay, but what is my point? It's not my point, it's the point of different people, obviously. But the market rewards depend on a host of factors which have nothing to do with ability and effort. And this is so even if we did not have the first problem, even if markets were perfectly competitive, markets are unable intrinsically to reward ability and efforts. Why? Well, because of different factors. First of all, what we offer, what we bring into the market, the product we bring into the market, it's not completely ours. It's the result of the combination of what we do with the external resources we inherit. External resources, both material and immaterial. I leave here with you with this nice quote by Hobhouse against the self-made man who was very proud because he has made his fortune, but in fact he did not make that fortune alone. Even a great writer as Virginia Woolf, she was saying at a certain point I found in a room on one sauna, she would say that even a writer like her, she was the writer she was because she was able to build her work on the thousands of people before her who had written and had contributed to the development of humanity. But this, the idea, well, leaving aside Virginia Woolf, the idea is first, what we bring to the market is the combination, yes, of our ability and effort, but also of external resources. Then we have macro division of labor and teamwork. Adam Smith was very modern in this point of view because Adam Smith was not talking too much about the differences of ability as a source of productivity, but he was saying the division of labor is important because it's that which is the engine of productivity and which in a way enriches the abilities which in themselves would be quite similar. And then obviously teamwork. We work together. We never worked, even in a university. We work with the people in the administration. We're not with our colleague. We don't work alone. We work with students. So it's a combination of, it's a teamwork. It's all a teamwork. And teamwork is becoming even more intricate and complicated today. Just think about outsourcing of, Crouch was talking about, featured work, global value chain, and so on. So it's very complex. Teamwork is becoming, it makes the disentangling the contribution of each more and more difficult. Firm size. Firm size is again something which does not depend on me. If I'm lucky enough to be hired by someone who is in a big firm, I have the prospect of getting higher reward than someone else with the same ability and the same effort. And as Freeman was pointed out empirically, this effect happens irrespective of the problem of sorting. So it's quite robust. Then, not only what we bring into the market, but what we get into the market depends on something which is not ours. Depends on the interplay between supply and demand. We can have the same ability and effort, but then if demand and supply go backward or downward, things will change. Warren Buffett very candidly said, yes, I'm very able, I know I made a lot of money, but I had the fortune of living in the United States in a time where the people in the US praised my competence. If I were in Bangladesh, I would not have had the same destiny. So the market cannot, even if competitive, reward ability and effort. And so we need other mechanism to decide, to distinguish what is ours and what is not. And what is this mechanism? Property rights. Property rights do exactly this task. But this whole question is wholly underrated by meritocracy. And what is the risk? The risk is that if you don't consider, if you take as given property rights, you can legitimize distribution which are wholly unfair, because property rights can define what's mine and what's yours in totally unfair ways. an important implication. I was glad because for a while I was trying to put together different ideas of economists and people like Ferraioli and Rodotà. And this consideration I just made, in a way, underline the dimension of power which is implicit in property rights. Economics, even classical economics, recognizes obviously property rights because a market needs property rights to function. But property rights in that perspective are just some mechanism to enforce exchanges. While if we think that it's very difficult to apportion what is mine and what is yours, property rights intrinsically entail a dimension of power. As Rodotà said, property rights are terribile diritto, a very awesome right, exactly because they enshrine a distribution of power. And also Bolz and Gintis, they are in their way, they are intrinsically contested and contestable. Okay, so the second set of problems, the second set of intrinsic shortcomings of the meritocratic justification of market inequality has to do with the incapacity of the market to reward exactly merit. Because the market rewards a bundle of things according to how property rights are set, and property rights can be set in very unfair ways. Third set of problems of meritocracy is related to meritocracy in itself and not so much to market. And the first one has to do with some other unfairness. Do we deserve the lack of the natural lottery? And if I am born particularly intelligent, do I deserve? Should I get a prize because I was already lucky enough because I was not born crippled or with some other handicap, and then I also deserve the further gain of getting more money than other people. And as Rawls was saying, probably natural lottery is totally irrelevant from a moral point of view. At the same time, we know we will never be able to realize equality of opportunity also in order to fight the lack of the social lottery. As long as we have families, even in the best world, families will always influence children development. And so some kind of the lack of social lottery will remain. And meritocracy, again, will prize someone who was lucky enough to have good parents and to be able to earn more. And I find some a bit problematic from a moral point of view. There is then in meritocracy the dark side of talent. The dark side of talent was already recognized by the Scottish philosopher in the 18th century by, for example, Ferguson. And it was nice because everybody was for the market in 17th century. They were great defenders of the market, but they saw the dark side of talent. Why? Because talent, merit, if you feel you are very able, that you become very arrogant, and the other people, you feel a sense of superiority, and the other people a sense of frustration, and there is some form of divisiveness in society. I don't know if you read Young, The Rise of Meritocracy. It's a dystopia, and anyway, at the end, in his book, what's the end? This is all a book about meritocracy, and it is a place all the people with a higher IQ run the world, and everything is done according to merit. What's the end? The end is like the crowd who has a very little IQ is so mad at the people with high IQ, and they have a very nice manifesto. It's called the Chelsea Manifesto, and they fight and they kill all the people with high IQ. That is an extreme case. Anyway, meritocracy risks to breed a divisiveness in society, and probably today we don't need more divisiveness and so on. Another point is meritocracy can also lower propensity to resist. The ongoing public debate should deal with that, the definition of a fair system of property rights, defining what one could get and what one could not get, as I said. Okay, I don't finish it. Obviously, no system of property right can precisely apportion precisely define what is mine and what is yours, and obviously some lack will always remain, both lack from the market, lack of the natural lottery, of the social lottery is unavoidable. Yet, once fair property rights, fair rules of the game, and I'm thinking, for example, minimum income, worker representation in governance of the enterprises, progressive taxation justified, inheritance taxation, and so on. Once fair property rights are put in place, I think people could claim to deserve what they get, and the ensuing inequalities could be justified. In a way, doing this kind of exercise, we would, using Dworkin's terms, we would transform the brute lack, the unjustified lack of the market and of the natural and social lottery into an option lack, because we decide as in a fair way, relating to each other as equals, we would decide norms, fair norms of apportioning what is ours and what is not. Finally, well, in brief, the conclusion is the market cannot do this job. We need politics. And assuming that it can, meritocracy has a big risk of leading to unjustifiable economic inequalities. And last point, even is not, I should have said it before, but I always worry, I'm struck by the fact that meritocracy, in a way, was developed in the 18th century, when the market was the market of the artisan, of the farmer, and now then went back, and now we are kind of making, relying on this theory of justice in a world which is just so different from the world of the artisan and of the farmer. Anyway, this was just a little closer at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena, and for having pointed at the important element of normative justifications and critique of normative justification. As a discussant who will address all the different positions and ideas that have emerged, we have Giovanni Dosi, who is economist at the Scuola Sant'Anna. He has been working on several issues which also address inequalities. He has worked in particular on innovations, organizations, and the economic dynamics, which is also the title of one of the collection of his work, and the economic organization, industrial dynamic and development is the topic of another of the collection of his work. He's also the head of the Institute of Economics.
He was.
He is no longer. He's happy, and he's happy about that, we can see. But he has been the leading economist in Pisa at the Scuola Sant'Anna, and we have been collaborating and hope to continue this collaboration in the future. Giovanni, thank you, and you have the floor.
Thank you. It's fascinating, at the same time very challenging, because these papers are really foundational. I mean, both from the point of view of the theory and from the point of view of the historical interpretation. I think inequality is indeed even more generic, a very generic property of capitalist dynamics. And this should worry us even more. Let me if you bear with me 3 minutes, I'll try to be as little technical as possible. I mean, income in capitalist economies is more or less a multiplicative process. You have income of the people that grow some percentage, or does not grow some percentage. Now, all the multiplicative processes end up with a distribution that is at least log normal. That is, log normal, it means that already in absolute terms you've got a higher tail. If everyone has the same expected growth. So already a multiplicative process of incomes leads to growing absolute inequality if left to itself. I mean, in a way, we lost our egalitarian virginity when we stopped being hunter and gatherer, when it was additive, if anything. I mean, I'm catching another animal today, but this does not mean that tomorrow I will catch another one. This is the bottom line. Log normal distribution, that is, if the income grows, then the absolute divergence between top and bottom increases. But in capitalist economies, is a bit more than that, because you have got different groups that have got different multipliers. Typically, capitalist accumulation is subject to increasing returns of some kind, the capital centralization, financialization of the economy, and centralization of ownership. The very competitive process introduces a correlation, because if I win, you lose. So that introduces a correlation in the growth process, in which there is someone that gets more than proportionally, that depends on what he got before. Technically, this produces distribution that are called power law or more. There are distributions that don't converge in the variance. So that means that inequality explodes. In a sense, the glorious 30s were almost an exception in the history of capitalism, because you had policies and institutions that were making the different income claims more or less similar in terms of rate of growth. And in fact, I mean, you have after World War II, the share of wages that remains more or less constant, even increases a bit in many countries. For reason that Mario explained to us, this setup ended. And in a way, capitalism went back to its wild nature, in which the claim of, say, capitalists, and among them financial capitalists, were growing faster than the claims of wage earners. And Mario was showing us a part of the wage earners had claims that were negative. I mean, successful claims that were negative over the last 30 years or so. How do we interpret that? I mean, the factual phenomenological explanation is the one that Mario gave us, and I'll come back to that in a second. But economists, in any case, have the temptation methodologically to say, well, you have what you deserve. Even Piketty uses a production function. A production function with all the whistles and bells then says that you get what you deserve. You get the marginal productivity. This is a fallacy that we should abandon. Production and productivity is essentially a function of organizational technological capabilities. I mean, this goes back to the discussion on merit. Has nothing to do with individual ability. I mean, the productivity of fiat, is it due to the sum of the productivity of the one vaulting, and plus the marginal productivity or Marchionne. Incidentally, if you believed in a theory of marginal productivity and related meritocracy revealed by the marginal productivity, then you should claim that Marchionne must have had a 2 orders of magnitude intelligence more than Sloane, because his salary was 350, 400 times more than Sloane, which frankly I doubt. In fact, I mean, as productivities are a function of organizational and technological capabilities, the distributive share, that is the successful claims, essentially depend on power, on the political power that you have within organizations, via direct or indirectly via politics, and very little on productivity. This also, and I close this parenthesis, this also militates in favor of all the explanation of inequality in terms of skill biases of technical change. Is not at all so, simply because the wages do not depend on the demand of supply of particular skills, but depend a lot on the bargaining power of the various groups. Relatedly, and again is supporting Elena's view against meritocracy, abilities are acquired, are learned within organization. It's not that Marchionne was endowed, whatever that means, with the ability of managing. Or you can have evil abilities. I mean, Goebbels was not endowed with the ability of being a criminal. He became, to a good extent, he became, I mean, when it was age 0, probably he was not Goebbels as Goebbels. Your socialization history, your learning history, brings you to acquire also particular ability rather than others, which in a way militates also in favor against the meritocracy view, even if you were an extreme liberal that says when you die, inherited tax is 100%, so we start, but if the abilities are learned, it means that they're path dependent. And so inequality reemerges at each round for reasons that are independent of the initial ontology of yours, but depend on the history of, is a generalized version of luck, if you are. Sort of luck. Now, I think these are, even if they're methodological and abstract, then I've got this consideration, I've got a lot of consequences in terms of how do we handle politically inequality? Because if you think that inequality is a natural outcome, say, of difference in marginal productivity, well, it's very difficult then to handle them. If you think that they depend on essentially an institution, conflict, and policies, then it's much more in our hand to shape them. Now, with this, do I have 5 minutes now? With this framework in mind, what made this dynamics of claims change after the glorious 30s. Well, that was the presentation of Mario, and basically it boils down to 3.5 factors. One is the change in power relation, the unionization, in which technology plays only an indirect role. It is indirect because it makes easier to delocalize. And this is the second major cause, what I call the Walmart model. First, in your shop in the US, you were going to buy, say, a table made in a unionized firm, paying decent wages. The table was costing what it was costing. Now Walmart says, I make the Chinese worker make the table at much lower wages. So if you don't believe in general equilibrium, the people in the table maker in the US get fired. The Walmart imports at a much lower cost the table and sells it, yes, at marginally lower price to the consumer, those that have got the money to buy the table, because maybe the workers that before were able to buy the table, now they are unable to buy the table. The end of the story is lower wages in the US, the same wage as before in China, an enormous increase in the profits. This is indirectly allowed by technology, but does not have, is not a question of demand and supply of skills. More directly related to technology is the fact that you've got an increasing role of platform economies, and what sometimes I think of as a sort of high-tech putting out system. I mean, we are getting to before the first industrial revolution, and before the emergence of the factory. In fact, the factory were there to control people and to make sure that they were working hard continuously. Now you have got high-tech enough in which people are in the position of controlling themselves. And so you have got a sort of impersonal distance control of the workers that many often don't perceive themselves as workers, by the way. And this, of course, contributes to the power, the worsening power distribution. And the other point, rightly so emphasized by Mario, but is a consequence of the general point that Colin was making. You have got a fall in all the redistributive policies, because you have got a retreat of politics. I'm not sure. Maybe is the conquest by the rich and the powerful, the privatization of politics by the rich and the powerful. With this increasing interaction between money and power that Colin was talking about, with all the things that we know, less universal provision of services, less transfer, less everything. This, I think, also points to us where to head on. I think that, as Palazzo was saying, paying taxes is beautiful, especially for those that can afford it. But we have got to go back to this Weltanschauung in which we say taxes are fundamental. And progressive taxes are fundamental. And some taxes on wealth are absolutely necessary. Reintroduce into this discourse the idea that the foundation of universal citizenship is a progressive redistribution of income and wealth, which is again Colin's point that the risk is always that the economy colonizes the politics, and in fact killing both the market and democracy. And I end here.
Thank you, Giovanni. I was wondering if maybe the paper givers want to give a first round, or do we open? We open?
Thank you. I'm Andrea Cornia, formerly with the University of Florence, now honorary professor, so I'm a free thinker now. Now, I would like to make a comment basically on what Mario said. I think that he discussed 4 drivers, and normally we make a distinction between the immediate, i.e. statistical, causes of rising inequality, and then the deep-seated cause of inequality. But I think it didn't go far enough. I think why, for instance, there has been an increased wage differentiation among sectors, you know. And I would propose that, in addition to what he says, and I agree with what he said, 4 additional factors, which are really deep, 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 and they go beyond the decision taken at the national level. And these are basically or largely exogenous at the national level. One is technology. Giovanni mentioned that. I think if you look at which are the sectors which have developed a lot during the last 20 or 30 years, these are the utilities and the high-tech sectors. So sectors which have huge economies of scale. So these are economies which require very large investments. Now, they are like natural monopolies in a way. And now these have been privatized almost everywhere, certainly in Italy. And I think, as Colin Crouch has mentioned, competition policy has been very weak. This is an unresolved problem in economic theory. So when you say, well, okay, there is, I don't know, the Lyonnaise des Eaux, which provides water in Fiesole, they do what they want, no, we regulate them. But actually, it is a failure, the regulation. So this is a major problem. Now, problem number 1. The second one, globalization. I mean, I think the IMF in the World Economic Outlook of a few years ago cited that with the globalization of trade, liberalization of trade, something like 1.2 billion workers from China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and so on and so forth have arrived on the labor market. And that has certainly depressed wages, and certainly depressed unskilled wages. And that has helped widening the scissors between skilled and unskilled wages. Now, is globalization something which is endogenous, is driven by government decision? Well, I think in part is not, because computers, I mean, is the old story in the growth model where the technology is freely circulates across countries, and I think in part it is. And but I think there is a large ideological component, and I've been always taking side against this sort of unfettered globalization. And now we see that in the US, perhaps they have elected Donald Trump because of Ohio and Minnesota losing jobs in sectors which are affected by strong external competition. Now, the third factor is demography. I think this has been mentioned, and demography is a factor which is also, to a large extent, exogenous. I mean, there are many people's decisions, but we know that the poor, they have much larger families, and that alters the distribution of the dimensional distribution of income. And there is plenty of evidence about that. And finally, weaker redistribution, which is policy. But if I take the theory of collective action by Mansur Olson, for instance, I see that the redistribution is much more difficult in societies which are heterogeneous. And I think that what we have seen with migration within countries, across countries, and so on and so forth, an increase in the countries' heterogeneity. I lived in the two extremes of the spectrum. In Finland, where people, they feel, I don't know now, but when I lived there, they are all the same. So it's one of the most homogeneous countries on earth. So if I pay a lot of taxes, this will go to my brother, my sister, somebody who's like me. And then I lived 10 years in the US, where the society is very heterogeneous. And the main argument is say, why should I pay taxes to finance these minorities? They don't work, they make a lot of children, and so on and so forth. So I think that these are deeper causes what has happened. And the question is, since they are to a large extent exogenous, they are not easily treatable in policy terms. What do we do? Do we bring back globalization? I think probably we have already started doing it in some respect. Do we want to go back to autarky? No, but I mean to a more controlled globalization. Yes. Thank you.
Hasse Ekstedt, University of Göteborg, Sweden. I was in Russia in the beginning of 90s, working for under the auspices of Sweden and European Union, Swedish government. I happened to see there the very primary process of creating property rights. It starts with possession. Now, I helped the Swedish television to make a program of Novaya Zemlya, the nuclear test site. And then we discovered that the owner of the property rights to Novaya Zemlya, according to the Russian law, was the admiral of the North Sea. And we saw it in the creation of plutocrats in Russia, how they utilized their power to create property rights. Colin, you said, to my formerly surprise, that the acquisition of these enormous fortunes were a threat to market economy. Elena, you placed much role on property rights. So I ask myself, are we going back to a situation where the creation of enormous fortunes threatens property rights through the financial market, through the money handling? We have seen during the last 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, switch from the currency school mainly to the banking school. And that is creating the means for actually using the credit market for shifting property rights. I have also a question to you, Elena. There have been some discussions of distribution. Does it, according to you, exist an optimal inequality or equality, whatever you call it? Can we talk of an a kind of, I'm not asking you the practical thing, just the theoretical. Can we think of such an optimal inequality? Thank you.
I have two small requests for clarification to Elena. The first of all, thank you to all of you for a very interesting presentation. So I agree with the point you make about meritocracy. It occurs to me how important has historically been for the legitimation of capitalism this theme of meritocracy. And it strikes me, but I want to hear your view. It's not been a central theme. I mean, if I think of the foundational justifications of capitalism, they don't have to do. They generally have to do with protection of freedom, not meritocracy, fair allocation of rewards. So who do you have in mind? Because it seems to me this theme of legitimating a market society, which may be different from capitalism, through meritocracy, is a typically Italian theme, I think. I mean, I find it when I read, Giavazzi and Alesina, when I read, I don't remember his name, the economic counselor of Renzi about meritocracy and so on. So I find it in Zingale's, Capitalism for the People. Yeah, so is it more than this? Or so that's the first thing. And then the second thing I wanted to ask you, I mean, I would like you to clarify, maybe you didn't have time towards the end, but I seem to have spotted possibly a contradiction in the way you develop your argument, because you start off by saying it's so difficult to attribute merit to an individual. The organization of work involves collaboration, work is a social process, and so on and so forth. And even if we try to target particular features of the work through incentives, those incentives are very likely to backfire, as we all know with these incentives in the university system. So you start by saying it's very difficult to attribute to individual, and then your solution is, let's fix the system of property rights. How does that overcome the problem that you identify?
I think I will give the floor back to the speakers for a first round of answers. Just wanted to add two comments, because I think that also the questions turn around two issues. One is this a challenge inequalities? Is it a challenge to democracies and also to the markets? So is this something that would produce a sort of self-destroyal by capitalism, as in Wolfgang Streeck's expectations, or is it the public losing towards the private? And the other issues which I think emerged also is how to intervene in this. Charles Tillis said once, but he was not the only one, in order to have rights, you have to have someone who implements the rights. And the nation states have been implementing the citizenship rights until now. And it seems that they still do, because still in your last slide, the Scandinavian countries were on the lower corner. And so the issues which has been mentioned also of liberal globalizations and how much, in order to resist it and return to rights, it is also necessary to put the nation state back, I think was one of the questions which was implicitly or explicitly
First of all, thank you very much for a very challenging question. I start with an answer which has to do not with one question which was addressed to me, so probably was easier, and was by Cornea. And like when he was saying that the heterogeneity, especially with migrants and so on, makes redistributive policies harder, I totally agree. Yet I think that policy design matters a lot. For example, if we do rely more and more on means testing, obviously we increase the risk of divisiveness, because means testing is inevitably arbitrary, and so we see all the poor migrants getting transfers and Italia do not get anything. Or for example, in Italy, interesting problem how the means testing is doing in a way helps migrants, because migrants basically send their wealth to their country of origin, so they seem poorer than the Italian ones and so on. But those are not, I think that through policy design probably, and through a bit more of universalism, obviously one cannot solve, you are totally right, homogeneity makes it welfare state stronger and easier. There's the nice paper by some Scandinavians was called the equality multiplier, when you have equality of condition, also Tocqueville already said that, is easier to make redistribution. But still, policy design probably can help a little decrease the difficulties of doing redistribution in a heterogeneous polity community. Going back to the question which were addressed to me, the first one, property rights. Property rights obviously can be defined, as I said, are a contested issue, and I will go back also to your question, are a contested issue, so they can be defined in different ways. We have on the one side the oligarch, on the other side the citizenship income a la Van Parijs is a different way to define property rights, exactly because a lot of the value added which we all realize together does not go to us now, but should go to us. We have a property right in this part of common product of our activities, which today is taken by someone in an unfair way. And citizenship income is a property right of each of us in the common resources together we all produce. Castell was saying that the welfare state was also part of our property right. So I don't think property rights should necessarily be defined in one way or the other. They are a political question, they are a contested question, and in fact I was stressing the need to define them in a fair way. And the other part of the question was about optimal equality. No, I don't think there is any optimal equality. I don't think we can define a pattern. Nozick would talk about a pattern model of justice. I don't think so. I think what is important is to realize institutions that are fairly defined on the basis of rules that are fair, and then you can, in a way, that's like I don't want to make more quotation of roles, but anyway, justice is a virtue of social institutions. So you have to work through making the institution work in a fair way, not look for a specific pattern, because as Giovanni was saying, you cannot have equality changes all the time, so we cannot have a static pattern of equality to which we should aim to. So no, I don't think there is any optimal equality, but there are fair or unfair institutions. The last two questions, the first one had to do, the first criticism, the first objection was, your paper is a kind of a provincial paper because only in Italy we talk a lot about meritocracy, not in other places. As far as I know, and from the books I'm reading about meritocracy, it seems to me that first of all is also British and the third way problem. This book by Littler I was quoting at first was giving a lot of evidence on the importance of meritocracy, not least, obviously in the third way in England, all the people saying, for example, only poverty counts because inequalities are deserved. You are totally right that at first, like at the beginning, for example, von Hayek, the first defender of the market, they were not building their argument on merit. They were, in fact, they were very much against merit, and they were only for freedom, and you are totally right. But it seems to me that starting from the 70s and the older resurgent backing of market inequalities through also an ideology that justified these market inequalities relied more and more on merit. Also in the United States, this justification is more and more widely used. So I don't think, it's definitely an Italian when one writes, in a way, talks with himself, with the people around him or her. But I don't think it's only an Italian problem. I think it's a more general problem. The last question, which was about the risk of arbitrariness, incoherence was not, of incoherence in my presentation, because on the one side I said, well, it's impossible to disentangle all the different elements, but at the end I defended fair property rights. I don't think I was I have to justify myself. There is a very nice article, at least, which I really like, by Elizabeth Anderson, What's the Point of Equality? And she ends up saying that what we can do is just to embrace a range of acceptable deviations. So since life is complicated and since we really cannot disentangle everything, we should be aware that we cannot do to the impossible utopistic goal of defining everything perfect, but at least we can avoid, like the extreme, we can avoid situations that are clearly unfair. For example, today, the way that the inequalities that Mario brought our attention to, 1% and 0.1% and so on, probably they just get too much, and it is totally unfair. Like if we had a dialogue based on justice, it's very difficult to defend this property right in this, and it's much more acceptable to defend, on the contrary, a higher progressive taxation, to diminish this, to have a stronger union defending their rights, and so on. At the end, it's impossible, I said, to disentangle, and there will be always lack. But at least I will have avoided the extreme of the unfairness which today exists. I hope I answered, then I can talk.
I may add a thing. My impression is that these issues of meritocracy is more and more used also in comparing countries. So free markets means that in this type of ideologies, all the countries have equal opportunities. And then if the Germans are better than the Greek, they have the merit, and the other is justified on this. Hey, Colin, would you?
Further thoughts on this issue of whether homogeneous societies are more willing to support redistribution than ethnically heterogeneous ones. And I think it is clearly true. And then there's the awful question of what policy implications does that have? Because at the moment we're seeing on both the left and the right arguments that use that as a reason for a new nationalism and a rejection of immigrants, a rejection of foreigners in general. And I can understand the logic of that. I think that sociologically, the arguments that say if you want a redistributive welfare state, you better keep foreigners out. But it's also a terrible argument because it leads to all kinds of very ugly behaviors. See, beginning of the 20th century, people in many countries would have said, well, we can't have very much redistribution because some of that money will go to the Jews. Now, today, outside Hungary, probably no one would say, we don't want the welfare state looking after the Jews in our society, because Jews have now become hopeful. With occasional reversals, accepted as part of the society. It's very interesting in Britain, where we have the fact that immigrants who came from the old countries of the British Empire are immediately citizens. You will never hear Jeremy Corbyn say Pakistani workers bring down wages, because Pakistani workers in Britain have the vote and they tend almost all to vote for the Labour Party. He will say Polish workers bring down wages because Polish workers don't have a vote. So there's a very ugly world in there. Obviously, in an ideal world, immigration would take place rather slowly and gradually, And so people can absorb what's happening, and they start to recognize people as like themselves. So they don't say, oh, that person speaks with a Polish accent, so I don't accept them, or that person has black skin, I don't accept them. People gradually learn, and in Britain and the Netherlands and in France, for years, we absorbed large numbers of immigrants from Africa and the Indian subcontinent, from the Caribbean, and gradually you saw families of mixed marriages, you saw friendship groups crossing these barriers, you saw the development of societies that celebrated enjoying each other's cultures. And then, the last few years, that has gone back and back and back, and is now getting worse and worse. Partly because of something that was completely exogenous and uncontrollable, the waves of refugees coming from the awful wars in North Africa and the Middle East. This is producing a phenomenon that is completely exogenous to all the things we like talking about, right? And is producing really serious strain. And to me, the answer can't be to start erecting real national barriers of exclusion, because that leads to a world, the world that we already know about, because we had it in the 1930s and the 1940s. We know what that leads to. But it does still leave us with the problem that you've said. And it's no good just pretending that problem's not there. It's real. We have to think through it. Try and work at it. Coming on to things that are much easier to talk about. No, the amassing of huge fortunes doesn't threaten property rights. It threatens the market economy. But ancient Rome had the most extreme property rights. The ability, a property owner could kill anyone who belonged to his property. An extreme sense of ownership, but it didn't really have a market economy as we would understand it. Feudal society, the kind of societies that dominated large parts of Europe in pre-capitalist time, had very undeveloped markets, but extreme senses of property rights. So I think property rights are different. They're always there. And in a way, the stronger markets are, the weaker become the absolute claims of property rights. So we may well be going towards a capitalist economy that has less vibrant markets, has much bigger concentrations of inequality, but that won't threaten property rights. It makes them more extreme. Finally, I agree with Elena that the meritocracy argument might not be important for the philosophical justification of capitalist inequality, but it's very important for the popular, for the popular political debate. The argument that you've earned your money, it belongs to you, you shouldn't be expected to pay taxes to provide health services for the poor. For Margaret Thatcher, this was a fundamental argument, that it was yours, it was your own hard work and merit that had got this, therefore no one should try and tax it. It didn't stop fixing up her son with a career as an arms dealer, because she took him to Saudi Arabia whenever she went there. But so there is this question: can you inherit? Is meritocracy heritable? But I think Elena was on to something very important for the public justification of inequality.
Of the heterogeneity, homogeneity is important, but I was thinking when Andrea mentioned Finland, that Finland is a typical case. They seem now homogeneous, but they had the most bloody and brutal civil war in the past, and they considered each other as enemies. The issues of refugees wave doesn't directly affect Eastern European countries, where the discourse is very, instead, hotly debated. So I think that this element of constructions which point at a loss of counter-hegemonic capacity on the left to make an argument about equality is... like Mario too.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. Let's start with Andrea Cornia. Within the changing power relation between labor and capital, finance, technology, globalization, and work control are there. So these two elements are deeply inside the factors that are reshaping the capital-labor relationships. I agree with the analysis that you made of technology and globalization. I would add on the specificity of technology some points also to Giovanni's arguments. Clearly, we are talking about a set of technologies which are within the paradigm of information and communication technologies and digitalization. And we have to emphasize, first of all, that technology is a social product. So we are not given by one set of technologies, technology are designed by capitalism since capital exists to reproduce itself on an extended way. So technology change the means of production, technology change the balance of power, create new type of work. And therefore, technology are an integral part, the shaping of technology is an integral part of the development of capitalism in its different context. And here the intellectual property right is crucial because is knowledge a private good or a public good? Is knowledge something I can patent or not? Is something I share with you for free? Or I will ask you to pay me to tell you the recipe of a cake. No? Yeah. So it's the boundaries is very interesting. The boundaries between private and public nature of knowledge is a crucial battleground, and the direction of technologies and networks with ICT and digital networks has been highly contested. On the one hand, we had all the progressive optimists saying we have the Wikipedia model, technology is shared freely outside the market, and then we had the monopolistic power of Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, and so on. So, and of course the latter project won, in spite of a decade in which some of our friends were optimistic about this. So in this context, technology is really reshaping both the learning processes and also the shapes of organizations. So as a matter of fact, the set of organization, large firms, learning processes, trade union, social relationships, that was guiding the dynamics of production and distribution for this time, has been completely skipped. And you have probably a system where there is a huge disintermediation. You don't need any more large production corporation because you use a platform in some areas. And at the same time, this, of course, goes hand in hand with a monopolistic control on a subset of activities. And so if, in this case, the relationship between economic condition and social identity and political organization mobilization completely changes, because I am not anymore a peasant becoming a factory worker. I am some sort of intellectual turning some intellectual output for a network which I do not control, and I work alone. And so all sets of social dynamics are deeply changed. In a way, Giovanni is right that we could go towards a capitalism where the putting out system before the Industrial Revolution, which needed large concentration of people, technologies, and sophisticated organization, could be one possible future. And this type of production future where you have monopolies and atomized individuals around it could go well hand in hand with the ancien regime, where you don't have democracy and you have a concentration of power in the hands of the monopolistic, and you don't have any need for a democratic process in that context. Finally, so this could be a deep transformation of capitalism, of course, self-destruction perhaps, so we clearly we're in a phase where different futures are around. the framework, when we talk about the framework in which these dynamics are embodied, is not just the factory, but also the nation state is one of these frameworks. So in a context where there was localized material production and the nation state was organizing the reproduction of that system, clearly there was a clear complementarity between this set of technologies, set of economic actors, and this set of welfare state and public policy at the national level. Now we are in a context where the technologies are global, the platforms and the networks are global, the integration of production is global, and we are failing to build social and political dynamics which are equally global. So that's your point that you made. But increasingly the idea of rights is also becoming global, because we have the idea of human rights, which is an important achievement. But think about climate. We can which is the major challenge we are facing now. The issue of climate change can hardly be framed within national frame, both for technical reason and for agency reason. So we can really also think that there may be emerging new frames where the nature of the challenges, the nature of the technologies, the nature of the everyday behavior has a structural transnational aspect. Clearly this means that it's very difficult to set up this enforcement of rights, but at the same time I think so I'm not seeing a return to a national agency as the only forced way, because there are some dimensions in which this is totally ineffective also in this context. So that's the. So this means that everything is becoming really more difficult in a sense, because we are also missing some strong players for distribution or for solving the complex justice, definition of justice, definition of rights, and definition of policies that we may need. But in the end, very sophisticated complex arrangements were developed by societies, and so it's not, there is, I'm sure there will be a dynamics. About the future, I think Polanyi has told us what happened at the end of the liberal phase, and the future is radical reform, which was the New Deal and the invention of welfare states and the role of the state. Or fascism, basically, an enclosing of these dynamics with society searching for protection from an authoritarian power.
The only problem with Polanyi is that he expected a return of social protection. With what we observe now is that, at least on the center left, those who were the agent of some moderate type of reform are very weakened. In some cases, no longer exist. So the questions could also be: do we need then also more radical forms than the ones Polanyi was thinking about? I wanted to ask also Giovanni if he.
Just two remarks. Yes. Mario, you emphasize a bit too much, I think, the international, you're a bit Trotskyist, the internationalist dimension that often comes as a justification of not doing things at home. In fact, I think we accepted, again, is back to calling point of economic power gaining political power. We accepted the discourse that states are impotent. Maybe they are not so impotent. Think of taxation. This is the first industrial revolution in which the main actors of the revolution itself don't pay a fuck all in taxes. Even the robber barons, the railroad barons were paying little bit, but they were paying. This one, they don't pay absolutely anything. And we have the technical means to make them pay. So it's a matter of, and the justification should be Brussels to do it, is not flying. We can do it if we want, but we are prisoner of the Google of this world. Even technically, it is possible to control, to have Tobin tax or Keynes tax on shares and forex, because it's simply saying, well, all your transactions have got to go through a central bank. If I discover a transaction does not go through there, you are disenfranchised. Full stop. I mean, you are illegal. It's money laundering. Easy technically, very, very complicated politically, essentially because we must say it, the social democracy has betrayed the left, has betrayed liberté, égalité, fraternité, and has entirely accepted the discourse of the globalized capital and financial classes. And the only places where it survives is the UK, for example, where there is Corbyn. The other places where you had the Clintons, the Blair, the Schroeder, and later on they came after the end of the game, Renzi, have disappeared. Up here.
Is working? Yeah. I would like to take up two issues. I mean, one refers mainly, to the discussion about what Giovanni called the exceptional period of 1960s and 70s, and Mario's arguments about the power of capital over labor and of oligarchic capitalism. I think we should be aware of the background, to this exceptional period of the first decades after World War II. There were actually two kinds of dialectics bringing out their contradictions. One of them was the dialectic of modernizing imperialism, which created anti-imperialist nationalism, which, for a number of reasons, triumphed. After World War II, and reshaped. Both the economic and the political landscape in the big countries like China and India. Both countries, had been declining economically for more than a century, and after World War II, they started to grow economically and socially. Now, that kind of epochal change, which then continued, with the nationalist movements and anti-colonialism, is now past. And what we have instead of an international system with an inbuilt, inherent contradiction to it. That's what dialectic refers to. Modernizing imperialism. Now we have what we may vaguely and generally call globalization, which doesn't have any dialectic. It produces winners and losers, but the point of a dialectic is that it produces ever stronger losers, or ever stronger. But this is not happening, and so on. That doesn't create any, globalization doesn't create any stronger oppositional force to it. It creates resentment among the losers. And the second dialectic, which also, I mean, unfolded in the decades after World War II, was, of course, the dialectic of industrial capitalism, which Marx had predicted, I mean, 100 years earlier. It didn't unfold in the same apocalyptic way as Marx sometimes formulated it. But we should remember, I mean, that the years around 1980 was the peak of working class organization in the developed capitalist countries. Give and take a few years here and there, I mean, because it wasn't completely synchronized between countries. But it holds, I mean, for basically the whole industrial capitalist world, that that was the time when there were when trade unionization peaked, when the vote for labor parties of all kinds peaked. It was the time when industrial employment was at its height in a number of leading countries. Now, one of the points with contemporary capitalism, with financial capitalism, is that it doesn't have a dialectic. I mean, financial capitalism doesn't create an equivalent to the industrial working class. What it does instead, or contains instead, it's not just finance, but is a kind of industrial colonialism, whereby the industrial dialectic is displaced. You can see, I mean, the enormous importance of this new industrial colonialism if you look at the cost structure of an iPhone. Do you have an idea, I mean, how much the manufacturing cost of an iPhone is? I mean, for wages, but not only wages, also the profits of the subcontractors is less than 1%. Less than 1% of the cost of an iPhone. That's sort of industrial colonialism. It will certainly create some kind of industrial dialectic in China and in Bangladesh and what have you. But as long as it's inserted into a global system, if the workers in China become too uppity and too demanding, foreign capital will move to Vietnam or to Cambodia, which they are already doing. So that's, I think, this kind of context of the engines of inequality, which Mara put forward, I mean, might be helpful, I mean, to explain its background. Then the second issue I would like to comment on is the justification of inequality, or of economic inequality. I just want to mention, I mean, the three most frequent justifications I've heard in Europe over the last, say, 10 years or 20 years and so on. One is that inequality is necessary to recruit talent. It's no longer so much, I mean, as an incentive for people to work more. I mean, that's something which liberal economists sort of, I mean, pull out. But it's not that very important in the public discourse and so on. But if you want to recruit a top talent of some whatever sort, including from abroad and so on, you have to pay her or him an enormous amount. And the second one is fear of losing talent or losing asset holders and so on. If we raise taxes, then the brightest people will leave, or the people with the largest assets will leave the country and go somewhere else, and we'll all lose from that. And then the third argument, which is in some ways, I mean, the most pervasive of all in contemporary Swedish discourse, at least, is just indifference. Just saying, I mean, well, as long as everybody, as the income of everybody is increasing, what is the problem with inequality? I have absolutely no problem with the filthy rich, as Peter Mandelson put it in the UK and so on. Swedish capitalists and Swedish bourgeois politicians are a bit more polite against the rich than Mandelson was, but nevertheless. And that creates I think, something we have to think about. I mean, how do we answer that? What's the problem with economic inequality if everybody gets a little bit more every year and so on, which happens in some countries, not in Italy apparently, but it has happened in Sweden for the last 5 years, 6 years, something. Well, one is, of course, the damage which economic inequality do to people. Because, I mean, economic inequality is very strongly associated with problems of health and longevity. And there are other, but basically problems of health and life. And secondly, there is an argument about the hoarding of resources and the creation of unnatural, of artificial scarcity of resources. I mean, even in countries which are not run by Tory austerity regimes, I mean, like the Scandinavian ones, given the demography and increasing demographic demand on healthcare resources, old age care and child care and what have you, there is a scarcity of resources. And then, of course, a good part of these resources are actually available, but they have been hoarded by the 10%. And the third counter argument, I think, which is important, is because that, and that holds also, I mean, for all kinds of meritocratic arguments. Life doesn't end with the current generation. So in order to assess, I mean, the implication of inequality, we have to see, okay, what happens when this inegalitarian generation gets children? What does that mean? I mean, to the children of the poor, and if the current generation is very unequal? Well, it means, of course, that the possibilities of the next generation, of our kids, will be more limited and constrained because of the inequality in the current generation. And that's why the classical sort of liberal argument about distinguishing inequality of opportunity and inequality of outcome breaks down, because the outcome in one generation is structures the opportunity of the next generation.
Very much. I have 3 questions on this side. Let's start with Maria Kousis.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentations, and especially the late comments by Donatella on what about between countries inequalities on the meritocracy side, and Mario on the transnational dimension and the latest comments. It seemed to me that the presentations assume or discuss inequalities at the state level, and that is, they refer to policies and actors within nation states. What about, first, the transnational level, transnational capitalist class? That is a classical term. And what about the increasing, what appear to be increasing inequalities between nation states, based on the recent example of the Eurozone or the global financial crisis, and the Eurozone crisis. These are also linked to inequalities we experience within the state. But as most of you mentioned, the problem is quite complicated. And I just wondered if you could talk about whether the theoretical and methodological tools we have are able to catch this more interlinked aspect. We had a recent project on attributions of responsibility due to the Eurozone crisis, comparing Greece and Germany based on content analysis of national newspapers. And we see that a very large number, we had more than 11,000 attributions of responsibilities for the two countries. Half of them, about 5,000, were related to the classical interest groups, the 5 classical interest groups. What we noticed is that the attributions of responsibility on the Eurozone crisis were made especially by an increasingly more important group in the area of economic governance, that is the central banks and rating houses. And the policies especially for Greece and those countries that underwent, more Southern European countries that are undergoing severe austerity policies, were extremely important, because not only did they refer to inequality at an individual level, but they also refer to inequalities on a macro level that affect populations, which you just mentioned, the speaker mentioned, had to do with covering very basic needs, food, health, etc. So, what about this dimension? Inequalities in 21st century are not only taking place at the state level. If you have anything to say, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of your talks. They're very interesting. I just had a couple of questions, and very brief. One is about meritocracy. So I guess one of the curious things about the meritocracy discourse is that it doesn't really talk about the fact that if you have a real meritocracy, then not only do you have people climbing according to their capabilities and abilities, but you also have you also ought to have people coming back down, those who are maybe born into wealth but simply don't have the ability to keep it coming down. It might not just be wealth, but also power. I feel like perhaps that's one of the ways in which this is one of the things that's curious about the meritocracy discourse, that's not really emphasised, is it? And I feel like isn't that the place, the fact that that's not emphasised, precisely where, doesn't that show the role of ideology? So it's not just about just meritocracy pure et dur, but isn't it that there's sort of an ideological use of the discourse of meritocracy? The second one is slightly sort of out of it comes out of field, but since we're talking about the political consequences of largely economic inequality, I wondered if any of you had thought about this latest thing. And I think we're in a really specific moment in time where there's a real asymmetry in the information that's available, and I guess the information that's being collected. So each of us have phones, we have computers. There's a whole lot of surveillance going on about what we read every day, what we do every day. I feel like that kind of information is extremely sensitive, but we're also not super sensitive in terms of how we, in our daily lives, deal with it. But it obviously, I think, has some kind of a political quality to it, doesn't it? In previous times, this kind of information was collected and used for political reasons. And I feel like it has a very strong inequality dimension to it as well, because it's not like this information is available to all of us equally, but it's held, and it's held by a very specific group of maybe organizations and maybe even people. I feel like that's a dimension of political inequality that's really specific to where we are today. And so I guess the question is whether or not you have any sorts of ideas or thinking about that.
Thank you. Rossella? Final questions, and then I give the floor back to
Just very briefly, I wanted to add to the discussion about meritocracy. And first, thank you to everybody for the wonderful talk. And I just wanted to say that it's not only about how we as academics justify inequality, it's also about how people perceive and justify inequality, and that there is a lot of research on the moral economy of inequalities or normativity that shows, for instance, that merit is very important in how people justify the deservingness of the rich, earned wealth, for instance. And that in other places, for instance, in the US, Leslie McCall shows that people don't care so much about redistribution, but they care about equal opportunities, for instance. In Germany, it's about threats to the common way of life that are considered like as inequalities that we need to oppose. So, and it's, of course, it's not only about countries, it's also about class, this varies. So I think, what Elena did was interesting because, all of these principles, like reciprocity, meritocracy, and so on, could be unpacked. And I think it's an essential process of understanding this normativity. It's an essential process of understanding the production of inequalities, because through democratic processes, this fits into policies and then creates further inequalities.
give the floor back to the paper giver, starting with Colin.
I'm very sorry, I've got to leave very soon, so I'll use this privilege of going, then I'll disappear, but it's not rudeness. Just 3 points to pick up. Jørgen Terborn's point that there's no dialectic in globalization is really worth thinking about and working on. Because in the history of industrial capitalism, there was no one big dialectic of the kind that Marx anticipated, but one can see a lot of dialectic processes that took place. So it's really worth searching, are there medium-sized dialectics in globalization? And I suggest one that might be relevant for the wealthy countries of the world, not for China or Africa, for us, the Europeans, Americans. And that is, capitalism still needs us to buy stuff. It might, I've written a book about this, how the ideal population for capitalism is a population of extremely insecure workers, but very confident consumers. And that's very difficult to achieve. The main way that seemed to have been found to achieve that, so people could have wages that were not increasing but kept on purchasing, was to have enormous household debt. And that's what happened in the United States, United Kingdom, Ireland, some other places. Eventually, of course, that produced the Great Crisis. And now it's happening again. Household debt is growing. And now there's more countries going in for it as well. The East Europeans have started to get household debt. And so that fact that the need for us to consume the only way they've found of having more inequality but us still to consume is for us to take on a lot of debt. But that debt destabilizes the whole system. That might be a kind of dialectic to what. So, on the point about global inequalities, because one of the strange paradoxes of the present time that is often commented on is that virtually every individual country is becoming more unequal internally, but the world as a whole, comparing countries, is becoming less unequal. So the gap between the average Chinese worker and the average German worker is far, far less than it was years ago, but Germany and China have both become more unequal within them. So that actually is, in a way, globalization is making the world less equal at some levels. There is but you're really interested in what's happening within Europe and where, among European countries, there is growing inequality at the nation level. And this is really a phenomenon whereby both the East and the South are becoming kind of peripheries to a core Northwest. Now, for the East European countries, this is at least their peripheries. I mean, in the past, they weren't even peripheries. The real problem is for the Southern European countries and it used to be also Ireland. These countries were, for some for decades, the suppliers of relatively cheap goods to Northern Europe. And that role disappeared. It disappeared partly with the entry of Central and Eastern Europe into the capitalist market, and partly with the extension of a wider globalization. So it was no longer possible for Portuguese textile workers to provide cheap T-shirts for Germans and Dutch, because cheap T-shirts were now coming from China, Taiwan. So the Southern European countries lost their role. The problem is it was actually least in Italy, because the Italian economy hasn't been simply a supplier of cheap products. Italy and to some extent Catalonia also have very important high value-added products. But for the region as a whole, this was a need to adjust to new production models of how to get into high-quality production. It's a problem that predates the euro crisis. To some extent, the failure to solve it caused the euro crisis. The only country that escaped from it was Ireland, because they developed a different production model. It's not a very attractive one, but it is a new model. And so really, and of course, the euro crisis has made it much more difficult for these countries to get a new model. But I think there's a debate, an issue about the kinds of things that are made by firms in countries and how they compete in world markets, which is quite rather different from the main debates we have here today. Finally, just an observation on information asymmetry. In theory, information or knowledge are fundamental to how democracy works. Because without information, how can you be a democratic citizen? In practice, though, it's actually extremely difficult for an ordinary citizen who's not an academic to really have the kind of knowledge they need to act as real independent, thoughtful citizens. It's simply, the task is too complex, too time-consuming. The logic of collective action would never justify bothering to find out about a political issue. What happened historically in what we see as the sort of high tide of democracy is that people could identify with parties. They said, yeah, those people, they speak for me. So I haven't got time to get all the knowledge I need, but I reckon those people have, and I think they're going to work for me, so I'll trust them to get the knowledge that's needed to look after me. They may have been foolish to believe that, but most people did believe it. Now, what's happened since is the collapse of that ability of people, large numbers of people, to say, yeah, those people speak to me, I trust them to interpret the world for me. Plus, on top of that, this enormous growth of information that makes it, which is even more difficult to process than ignorance. So I think there is a real problem in that if people lose their belief that there are parties out there that interpret the world for them, if they no longer trust them, and then they're swamped with all this information, they have a problem. Well, what do you do? Decide it's all fake news?
Just two things. Building on Goran's point, the period of low inequality in the post-war eras was also a period of Cold War, with the competition between the West and the East, and clearly the egalitarian issue was an important battleground there. So it is very important, the global perspective you introduced, and the diversity of income distribution across countries, and this fate of Southern Europe is clearly has to be understood as the center-periphery dynamics that is inherent in capitalism, in capitalist accumulation on a world scale. So the inequalities are by definition not simply constrained within a society, but the system is producing inequality at all levels, with a hierarchy of countries, economies, economic systems, capabilities, and so on, which is now is being reshaped by the different types of technologies, different types of economic actors, and so on. So Southern Europe has been caught in this transformation, which is leaving Southern Europe much in a much worse position than it started with, and therefore the process of integration is crucial. In this sense, probably I don't think there is an opposition between either a national dimension where the game is decided and policy can be taken, or an international abstract playing field where the games is made. There is a very close interaction, and the example of taxes that Giovanni made is crucial. We have both to have domestic progressive taxation on wealth, taxation on Google and so on, but also we have to close the loopholes which allow Google to go to Ireland and not to pay taxes in the rest of the country. So the two things have to be reorganized in a coherent policy agency which can be adequate to face the challenges we have.
Okay. Fast, because I know it's 7 o'clock and people want to leave. Yes, there are so many arguments against for or against inequality. You mentioned at least two, which have to do, I think, more with efficiency. And the first one is to recruit talent, and the second one is the inevitability. If we tax people too much in the global world, people will just go away and everybody would lose us. And certainly those are two important claims, but I think they have more to do with efficiency, and I think they can be empirically answered. Is it really true that we lose so much taxation? Is it true that we need so much high inequality to recruit talent? And I think there are plenty of data which would go against this assumption, but I didn't want to treat efficiency or empirical data. The other two questions have to do with, the other two dimensions have to do with ethical justification. At a certain point you said, why some people, why is it undesirable that everybody gets a bit more? If everybody grows, why should I worry about inequality? And so, assuming that this is true, maybe now we have the great divergence as Mario was showing us, so not everybody, we are not in the same boat. As Krugman said, the tide only lifts the boat, the yacht, because only the big boats can gain. But anyway, assuming that everybody gains, why should we worry about inequalities? And you said as the main reason, consequences, basically, according to my interpretation. For example, if inequality, as you, Marmot, and other writers have shown, inequality can further have negative effects on health, and so this is a bad consequence. Or as the Korak Great Gatsby curve shows, inequality can have bad consequences in terms of equality of opportunity for the next generation and so on. I totally agree with that. My point was that I think that all these justification and arguments and counter arguments for or against inequality are quite acknowledged in a way. And I think that also process count. I think that even if inequality had no adverse consequences on poverty, on health, and so on, I think that from an ethical point of view, it's desirable to ask ourselves if the process of getting those high rewards and or the process leading to that kind of economic distribution is fair or unfair. I think justice is has not only to do with consequences, as for example Frankfurt would say, but justice has also to do with how things are, with ways through which we arrive at given results. So process count. And in this, given this assumption, I concentrated my speech only on meritocracy, because I think that, as Colin was saying, that deep down, this idea that we deserve what we get into the market is very much widespread. And I know, I agree with you, people think, there are differences in terms of how people think about meritocracy or other values among countries. Definitely, Italy probably is does give less weight to merit than the United States and so on. But still, I think that deep down, we think we deserve what we earn on the market. And I think that is a serious obstacle to do serious redistribution. At least this is my assumption. That's why I wanted to challenge that assumption, because I think that deep down is very important and we have to criticize it. So that's why I focus just on one aspect instead of taking into account all the other possible arguments pro or against inequality. The other point which was made to me was one, usually when we think about meritocracy, you are totally right. Usually when we think about meritocracy, we just look at climbing the elevator, the social elevator, going up and not of people falling down. Probably I was too fast, but when I was talking at the end, and I know I speak quite fast, but at the end when I was talking about the dark side of meritocracy was exactly that point, saying that we have, probably you do not merit what you get because so many other factors besides ability and effort influence what you get. But even if no other factors influence what you get, is it just your ability and your effort, your ability is pure luck. You have no moral deservingness just because you are more able. Then, okay, you can be you can have some, you can be prized for your effort, even though even effort is linked to ability and so on. But so the idea is that the problem of those who fall down has to be taken into consideration, and meritocracy usually when it's defended looks only at the good part that everybody climbs, but especially if society is polarized and the good places are because there is inequality, and good places are very, very, very limited, then the risk that so many people fall down is quite strong, and the effect of a sense of frustration and of divisiveness and so on will grow more and more.
Thank you, Elena. Giovanni, would you like to have the last word?
Last word.
Last word, no, but yes. No, just let me flag an issue that is underlying, not explicitly addressed in this discussion, but underlying. Think of two alternative vision, and I think we are nowadays at the bifurcation. I mean, Keynes, what are we going to leave to our grandchildren? Technology is going to free us from a lot of the boring work. We'll work one day per week, and then the rest dedicated to poetry, music, or whatever else. At the other extreme, I think of the film Blade Runner, in which you have got some sort of techno-feudalism that accumulates power, wealth, and technological knowledge. And the rest is sort of lumpen proletariat. I think we are now at the bifurcation, and well, the signs are bad that we are going in the second direction and not in the first one. But I think these are also the times in which you can exert a bit of social shaping of technology, about which Mario was talking about. Then when a set of paradigm is established, I mean, I think this is sort of social window opportunity. And my feeling, my pessimistic feeling, is that we are going in the wrong direction. This is the final, not very
final word.
So the final word for tonight, because tomorrow we will continue to discuss, and especially in the last sessions we will also discuss about alternatives. Now, paper givers, chairs, and discussants have merited a dinner. We can go together maybe.
They have not merited, but they are in the power position.
Talented or untalented. And for the others, I hope to see you all tomorrow morning. Thank you. And thank you to all the speakers. Al pomeriggio.